During the 6 years from the 6 Days War in 1967 to the Yom Kippur War of 1973, Israel invested massively in its Air Force capabilities. In 1966, Israeli Air Force consumed 25% of the defense budget. In 1973, it grew to 50% of a much larger budget. Following the crucial role the IAF played in June 1967, Israel General decided to sell the farm for a modern Air Force. This investment did not come without a price. Israeli infantry was still dependent on the Uzi, which was maybe effective for 100 meters if there was no headwind. A large proportion of the tank force was still World War II Shermans and petrol-engine Centurions. And with regard to artillery, no one thought it would be a good idea to invest in it, when a Phantom can carry 7 tons of explosives in one sortie. The justification for this massive investment was twofold. Until 1967, most of the Israeli Air Force was busy with defensive tasks, and thus was comprised of mainly interceptors. The French weapon embargo forced the IAF to buy US jet fighters. The Skyhawks, and especially the Phantoms, were designed to carry a bomb load a French Mirage can only dream of. Following the new capabilities, the IAF took upon itself to undertake ground attack as well as air superiority. The second reason for the extraordinary investment in the IAF is that unlike the rest of the army, which was mostly reserve, the IAF personnel were regulars, meaning in case of a surprise attack, the IAF served as an extra buffer. Considering the massive investment, the output of the IAF during the war was, let's say, less than impressive. The anti-aircraft arrays were still there at the end of the war, and no significant battle was swayed by the IAF. The whole war was solely conducted by the tank crews. So where was the Israeli Air Force at the Yom Kippur War? In the years before October 1973, Egypt and Syria, with the help of the USSR, reacted to the air superiority of the Israeli Air Force. An array of anti-aircraft missiles, such as SA-2, SA-3, and the long-range SA-6, were provided from the early 70s. Around the missile zone, crowded 23mm shield cars make sure low-flying airplanes will be hit. Israel was well aware of the challenge the anti-aircraft missiles made for the IAF. A plan, codenamed Tagar, was developed from the end of the attrition war until the October 73 war. The plan, designed to tackle the missiles array in and around the Suez Canal, consisted of 4 main stages. A photo reconnaissance to map the AA missiles' positions, especially the mobile ones. A strike from a distance to hit the anti-aircraft cannons. Shrike anti-radar missile. And lastly, a low-level accurate flight to hit the missiles themselves. This is of course a simplified version which omits the electronics devices carried by helicopters in order to distract the Egyptian radar, or the chaff rockets that were supposed to be fired all over the missile zone. This plan or any other plan has never materialized. IAF knew in the morning that the war is about to break in the afternoon, and since the Israeli government vetoed all options of preemptive strike, the entire Israeli Air Force was waiting on the ground for the war to start. According to plans made long before, a small part of the Israeli Air Force, 59 Mirage 3 and 5 and 12 Phantoms, will be ready for defense duties, while the Skyhawks and Phantoms will attack ground targets in the canal crossing points and enemy airports. However, 2 hours before the war, the main hero of this video, the IAF commander Benny Peled, ordered the entire Israeli Air Force to move to a defense mode. Oded Erez, the head of defense in the IAF, protested, claiming that 71 aircraft allocated to him is more than enough. And to begin with, Syria and Egypt Air Force only had a few dozens of Mirage and Sukhoi with enough range to hit Israel. Head of operations Giora Foreman resisted even more. The argument turned into shoutings, while the subordinate officers screamed at the head of the IAF, "Within an hour the entire Syrian Air Force will be on the ground." Meaning after the Syrian opening sortie, it will be a golden opportunity to attack the enemy airfields while they are most vulnerable. Peled wouldn't listen, and the fateful order, all for defense, went ahead. It was a full panic mode decision. No enemy aircraft even tried to reach Israeli airfield, and the IAF spent the entire first hours of the war waiting for an attack that never came. All this time negating Israel's ground forces and without attacking the Egyptian crossing of the canal on rubber dinghies. More than that, 300 Syrian and Egyptian aircraft attacked Israeli target close to the border, and since the Israeli Air Force waited for an attack deep inside Israel, most of them went back unscathed. Even now, decades after the war, it is hard to find justification for this decision. But as we will see, it was just the first in a series of odd calls that doomed the role the IAF played until the end of the war. As planned in practice years before the war, on the morning of 7th of October, the IAF went to perform the first strafe of Tagar. The first stage of Tagar was to neutralize the anti-aircraft cannons and the sensitive radar antennas. 52 Phantoms and 44 Skyhawks attacked the Egyptian anti-aircraft compound and airfields with slingshot strafe. The pilots reported good hits, and only 2 Skyhawks were hit. In the IAF operation rooms, it seems like they are back in business. However, before the Israeli jet fighters even came back, Peled gave the order to stop Tagar. I have previously made 2 videos regarding the first night at the Golan Heights. During this night, there was nothing but one tank called Airforce in front of approximately 2 Syrian divisions in the south of the Golan, and Israel Defense Minister Moshe Dayan simply lost it and went into full panic mode. At 027, Hofi, head of Northern Command, reported that in the south there is no sufficient forces and asked for aerial support. The IAF answered that low clouds make it impossible to help right now. At 4 a.m., Hofi called Dado, the chief of staff, and reported in military understatement, "The situation is not good." At 5:30, Dayan reached the central command room and after a short debrief, called Peled and said, "We are desperate. Only the IAF can help." At 6:05, Dayan flew on a helicopter to the Northern Operation Room. This time it became clear the formerly charismatic Minister of Defense simply lost it. Dayan called Peled and informed him that only the IAF can stop the Syrians from reaching the valley below. This panic mode had nothing to do with reality. At the time, in the North Sector fought 7th Tank Brigade with almost full force. More than that, early Sunday morning, first tanks from 669 Tank Brigade made it to the front. All this didn't stop Dayan constantly talking about the destruction of the third house. Now I must divert to a short history lesson. The Israelites had 2 terms of relative independence. First ended with the Babylonian Empire conquering the land they lived in, roughly 586 BD. And the second ended by the Romans at 70 AD. When Dayan mumbled about the imminent destruction of the third home, it was clear to all he meant a total destruction of the state of Israel. Peled fell victim to the panic virus. At 6:57, he gave the order to cancel Tagar in the south and start preparing for an attack on the Syrians' anti-aircraft missiles and ground forces. This did not bode well with Peled's subordinate officers. Head of Intelligence Rafi Harlev immediately stated that the Golan area is too small for the entire Israeli Air Force to operate in. Head of Operations Giora Foreman reminded Peled that the Israeli Air Force still have 300 jets, enough to assist in the Golan and carry on with the operation in the south. For the air crews just landed from the canal, the change of mission was a moral blow. It was clear that the IAF is simply not ready for that kind of operation in the north. Intelligence, or lack of. No photo reconnaissance were carried out before, and out of 25 frontline missiles array in Syria, 15 were SA-6, a highly mobile, latest technology AA missile that no one in the West knew how to deal with, and now the IAF pilots didn't know even where they are. The routes to the missile zone were full of Syrian ground forces. By the time a low-flying jet will reach his target, half of the Syrian army will fire at him with their own Kalashnikovs. All of the electronic devices carried by a helicopter designed to jam the missile's radar were still in the south. Moving them up north will take time, and Peled made it perfectly clear the attack should start before noon. In the briefing room, it became clear this is going to be a disaster. Some officers tried and stated the obvious. Some protested, but Peled wouldn't listen. In the hasty operation carried out in the Golan that noon, 6 Phantoms were down and 10 more got hit and somehow managed to land. As was expected, most of them were hit by simple projectiles rather than missiles. Worse off, the target zone were empty. Most of the missiles battery moved westward to avoid detection and to support the advancing Syrian forces. The effect of the air raid on the Syrian tank is highly contested. While the IAF said it made a difference, no one on the ground that day supported this. Syrian tanks kept on advancing until late Sunday evening, when a fraction of Israeli tank forces finally repelled them from Nafar base. And to begin with, less than 80 jets, a quarter of the IAF, participated in the attack. The failure debilitated the IAF for the rest of the war. More than the Phantoms and the pilots that were lost, the air crews simply lost trust with their leader. While the Iraqis were kept out of the loop on the date and time of the war, they had decided to help Syria with almost their entire army immediately when war broke. This time, the Israeli intelligence was accurate, and Peled was ordered to attack the Iraqi convoys before they could reach the front line while they are still outside the SAM missile protection. This was a 1,200-kilometer-long scandal. 700 Iraqi tanks, hundreds of armored vehicles, and thousands of trucks moved freely from Iraq to Syria without the intervention of the IAF. Even though everyone in Israel knew about it, and it was clear how vital it is to stop the Iraqi intervention. It was not just the bitter tank battles conducted in the north at the time. For years it was clear that a massive Iraqi intervention will force the hand of King Hussein of Jordan to join the war. A fair Jordanian front would be one strategic threat too many. The 1st Division reached Syria 4 days after the war had broken. On the 11th of October, the rest of the Iraqi army, some 3 divisions, arrived at the front and, according to various sources, saved the Syrian army from an imminent total collapse. And this was not even the biggest scandal Peled orchestrated during the war. Not even close. The IAF carried on with tasks that changed very little until the 9th of October, when Peled notified the Chief of Staff that his forces was very close to the red line. The red line in Peled's mind was the minimum number of jets that Israel required to defend the skies. No one else had ever heard of this term before. Peled decided that he must have 200 jets in order to keep Israel's skies safe from enemy aircraft. This was a blatant lie. To begin with, Egypt and Syria did not try to reach targets deep inside Israel, and Peled knew the enemy barely had jets with long-distance capabilities. Furthermore, at the beginning of the war, the IAF allocated 72 jets for defensive tasks. So why would Israel need 200 now? And when it was clear both Syrian and Egyptian air forces were depleted. And finally, Peled simply fiddled with the numbers. At the 9th of October, 3 days after the war broke, Peled declared that he has just 220 jets left, and would only have 200 within a day or two. No one contested him, and no one asked where 150 jets simply vanished. It was war, and in war times one tends to rely on reports from senior generals, especially from a general who oversaw such a technical and sophisticated branch. The true numbers were completely different. On the morning of the 10th, the IAF had 254 ready aircraft, with 48 more being serviced frantically and would be ready within a day, maybe even hours. Peled falsified the numbers by more than 30% and sabotaged the help the IAF could offer. The numbers kept on changing. On the 10th, Peled reported that he had 272 jets available. 24 hours later, after a very calm day where the IAF barely suffered any losses, he reported that he was down to 223 jets. The two numbers were completely different. Contrary to Peled's report, the IAF did not lose 140 but only 67 jets since war started. On the 12th of October, when the war was hanging by a thread, the IAF had 253 jets and 36 more being serviced after damage. Peled kept on reiterating gloomy predictions that had nothing to do with reality. Rather than losing 100 jets in the next 4 days as he predicted, the IAF lost just 36 until the end of the war. This video is already too long, but I must add one more story to the list. Abraham Tal, the Deputy Chief of Staff, predicted that crossing the canal will be the priciest operation in IDF history, and indeed it was. While the IDF established a small bridgehead across the Suez, the Egyptian army soon realized the threat and amassed all they could against the IDF crossing. Bodies were piled in their hundreds, and the Chief of Staff Dado learned that the IAF had bombed Kantara, a radar station that interested no one. Dado, who was above all a gentleman and never raised his voice during the entire war, sounded very close to losing his temper with Peled. Now listen to me, Benny. Until now I thought that our entire force should be concentrated in one primary mission. Now I want to understand if the Air Force is different and you have other priorities, because Kantara is of interest to my old grandma. I need now help in Missouri. This unprecedented conversation was the fruit of a war-long frustration, and maybe Dado already knew that Peled had falsified the numbers. In any case, the IDF ground forces were hanging on a thread while the IAF was busy with missions that served no importance. Now to the really big question. Why would he do that? What compelled Benny Peled to falsify reports, stubbornly confront his subordinate officers, and conduct a war of his own? After the war, Peled said that the false data he provided was part of his effort to encourage the Greens, Israel land forces, to attack and cross the canal. In his mind, the faint-hearted generals who spent their entire life in land combat needed encouragement to do the right thing. More than this, it became clear that Peled, a brilliant engineer with limited experience as a pilot and in the operation room, simply misunderstood the role of the IAF or the nature of war itself. Instead, he focused on targets that had nothing to do with the war effort or encouraging the IDF in fields he had no knowledge of. It is hard to draw conclusions from this story. Every army branch, no matter how able, cannot perform any better than their commander. Even more so, it is impossible to know in advance the character of the commander, his ability to listen to his subordinates and withstand the pressure of war. These qualities can only be tested in the heat of battle. The IDF reaction to the Israeli Air Force failure was a massive investment in ground capabilities. Some 50 years after the war, with no conventional enemy in sight, the IDF keeps 4 regular tank brigades as well as thousands of tanks in emergency warehouses. These are some 500 of the most sophisticated tanks ready at the push of a button. It is a huge cost for any country, let alone for such a small state.